One of the fundamental pillars of any well-functioning society is the enforcement of its laws. We play nice because of the enforcement of these laws and our collective agreement upon the state's right to practice force against us in order to maintain them. Rousseau wrote in The Social Contract that force doesn't create right, and that the citizen is obliged only to obey legitimate powers. So we forfeit some of our freedoms in order to create equality before the law and ensure the protection of our rights. Now, what are these rights and freedoms? What are we given in return for not practicing violence freely against who we please? Well, that would be an agreement among citizens to not rob, murder, and rape each other. Now, as a part of this social contract, those in authority positions also have a responsibility to show to the citizen that this contract is beneficial for both of them. Because why would the citizen otherwise freely consent to this form of submission? In my view, those in charge of the administration of justice and enforcement of Sweden's laws have failed massively at the task of upholding their part of the bargain. Our nation has for each year become less safe, despite what our politicians' pundits have been saying, while the freedom of the citizen to defend himself has remained heavily suppressed. So what gives? Do we still have a deal? Because if we don't, what could the effect be of the state repeatedly failing at its duty to defend the citizenry from who their legitimate power fundamentally comes? Well, it could be vigilantism. A society managed by watchmen, with no respect for the state or the rule of law, and who have taken back their right to use force against who they see fit. Citizens in this country have been repeatedly raped, stabbed, robbed, and beaten, and the perpetrators have been let loose upon society shortly after, far too often without receiving anywhere near adequate punishment for the suffering they've caused. Recent information coming from Sweden's Crime Prevention Agency shows that only 1 in 5 rapists of foreign descent gets deported from our lands after having often brutally raped a Swedish citizen. So again, what will be the result of such pathetic sentences for crimes that often destroy the lives of the victim and maybe even their entire family? Well, someone could get fed up. And despite Sweden being viewed by many as consisting entirely of weak cucks and willing victims who are too passive to react to the harm being done against them, we have several examples of what happens when a Swedish citizen has had enough. Case and point. Niklas Lindgren, aka Hagamannen. Niklas Lindgren is one of Sweden's probably most infamous and well-known serial rapists. Over several years he brutally raped women in the city of Umeå in northern Sweden. His last and final victim was a 51-year-old woman who he raped, nearly beat to death, and also bit off her ear. The sick fucker was later caught and sentenced to 14 years in prison, which is a pathetic sentence for a man who raped and nearly killed several women. And what's even worse is that he got released from prison after only having served 9 out of his 14-year sentence due to, I quote, good behavior. But there were a lot of people, including myself, who considered that sentence to be a complete joke. In August 2015, Niklas Lindgren, who at the time was taking a course in order to acquire a job, got jumped by 3 men who mercilessly beat him using punches, kicks, and a golf club. According to witnesses, one of the men bashed him so hard with an iron golf club that it snapped off on the top of Lindgren's back. Prior to getting the shit beat out of him outside of prison, he had also been savagely beaten in jail as well. As most of you probably know, rapists are on the bottom of the food chain in prison, and since he'd been all over the news, prisoners recognized his face and they went after him. And then we also have the story about this piece of human garbage. Abraham Ukbagabir is an Eritrean murderer who, after having his asylum application rejected in Sweden, decided to, as payback, kill 2 innocent Swedish citizens visiting IKEA in the city Västerås in 2015. Ukbagabir grabbed a knife from the kitchen department in the store and then attacked and murdered a mother and her son because, as he later stated, they looked Swedish. And since the victims were white, this of course was never labeled as a hate crime, despite it clearly being aimed against ethnic Swedes, but at least he got sentenced to life in prison. On a more positive note, Ukbagabir has in jail been repeatedly beaten so badly by Swedes that he's asked to serve the rest of his prison sentence in Eritrea instead of in Sweden, a request which has been rejected. He has been sent around to several different prisons and he's got his ass kicked in all of them. You can probably imagine what a Swede in prison, like this guy, thinks about a person who murdered a woman and her son because they looked Swedish. I can imagine the first conversation between those two being rather strained. So as you can see, in our jails there exist Swedes who hold such disgust against the murder of women and children, and will fuck you up so bad that they're gonna make you want to serve your sentence in a third world country instead of in the Swedish prison. The Swedes who you need to look out for rarely get covered in international news. And I do mean Swedes, not imported jihadi scum. In Sweden there exist killers who have carried out their own little race wars against innocent people. So just imagine if you'd actually give them real, factually based motivation. Imagine if you give them targets who we all know actually really deserve to be punished. What then? The willingness to practice brutal acts of violence against murderers and rapists does indeed exist in this country. And a lot of the people who are willing to practice such violence will one day be set free. The question we should ask ourselves is, are these the people we want to handle the distribution of justice in Sweden? When someone rapes a Swedish citizen, should the punishment be settled in our courts or afterwards by this guy? Because the Swedish trust in our judicial system is today so incredibly low that only the sheltered, naive, and unharmed still believe that it functions properly. Which means that going out at night to crack some skulls with your boys might in the future be given validity. Because they are targeting scum who actually should be locked up, and everybody knows it. Cases where 5 rapists get let loose upon society without any punishment despite brutally beating and raping a Swedish woman for 4 hours. These cases are shown to be to a majority carried out by young immigrant men, and a majority of them never spend a single day in jail due to soft on crime policies against young offenders. These cases of massive injustice risk creating a future for us in Sweden where people silently cheer when vigilantes, often being criminals themselves, go after rapists, pedophiles, and killers, while those who have been tasked with actually administering justice stand idly by while doing nothing. And of course, as most often is the case with vigilantism, innocent people are going to get caught in the crossfire. And I worry about a future rise of vigilantism in Sweden, not because I give a shit about rapist scum who can play football with their heads for all I care. I worry because I know good people who happen to come from an immigrant background, who will be targeted as just being one of the far too many criminal immigrants who have been let loose back out on our streets after having shown to everybody that raping or beating a Swedish citizen is something that you can get away with. Not all immigrants are criminals, obviously. Only an idiot would make such a claim. But only criminal immigrants benefit from a judicial system that practices racial favoritism against those who happen to be non-white immigrants. It's a racist practice and it needs to be stopped immediately, both for the sake of native Swedes who deserve justice and for the law-abiding immigrant who shouldn't be forced to feel distrusted by native Swedes. Immigrants and asylum seekers are overrepresented when it comes to sexual violence and crime in general, but not all of them, and no one deserves to be collectively punished for the crimes of others. I will never accept blame for slavery just because I'm white, and I will never take responsibility for the beating of women just because I'm a man, and neither should the law-abiding immigrant be forced to, at knife point by vigilantes, share the blame for disgusting acts being carried out by scum who just happen to share his country of origin. So either our judicial system starts working, or an entirely different kind of justice will be carried out instead. We need a society in Sweden where we know that the immigrant you meet out on the street is a law-abiding citizen just like ourselves, and that the criminal immigrant is locked up and is properly punished for his crime. Until we see that happen, racial hostility will be live and well in Sweden, and the frustration which breeds vigilantism will continue to grow, not only in Sweden but all over Europe as well. Thomas Paine wrote in his pamphlet Common Sense that the law is king, meaning that in a free country the law should supersede all else in power over the lives of the citizen. But I fear that in Sweden the king is dying, and that in the very near future a tyrant might take to the throne instead.